धम्मो सुपटिपन्नो यस्य भगवतो सावक संगो तमयं भगवन्त सधम्मं ससंगम् इमे हि सकारि यथार्हम् आरोपिते हि अभिपूजया साधुनो हन्ति भगवा शुचिरपरिनिभूतोऽपि पश्चिमा जनतानुकम्पमानसा इमे सकारि दुर्गतपनाकार भूते पटिगणातु अम्हाकं दीर्घरथ हिताय सुखाय अरहं सम्मा सम्बुद्धो भगवा बुद्धं भगवन्तम् अभिवादे सतो भगवता धम्मो धम्मं नमस्सामि सुपटिपन्नो भगवतो सावक संगो संगं नमामि अन्नमयं बुद्धस्य भगवतो उभभाग नमकारं करोमसि नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स हन्तमयं बुद्धानुसतिनयं करोमसि तं खोपन भगवन्त एवं कल्याणो किति सद्दो अभुगतो इति पिसो भगवा अरहं सम्मा सम्बुद्धो विद्याचरण संपन्नो सुगतो लोकविदु अनुत्तरो पुरुष धम्म रति सत्था देव मनुष्यान बुद्धो भगवाति हन्तमयं बुद्धाभिगीतिं करोमसि बुद्धवारहन्तवरता द्विगुणाभियुतो शुद्धाभियान करुणा हि समागततो बोधेसियो सुजनतं कमलं वसुरो वन्दामहं तमरणं शिरसा जिनेन्द्रम् बुद्धो यो सबपाणिनं शरणं खेममुत्तमम् पठमानुसतिष्ठानं वन्दामि तं शिरेणहम् बुद्धस्सास्मि दासीवा बुद्धो मे सामिकिस्सरो बुद्धासहं नियादेमि शरीरं जीवितञ्चिदं वन्दन्तीहं चरिष्यामि बुद्धस्यैव सुबोधितं नत्थि मे शरणम् अन्य बुद्धो मे शरणं वरम् एतेन सच्चवज्जेन वड्ढेयं सतु शासने बुद्धं मे वन्दमानाय यं पुण्यं प्रसुतं विद स करोमसि स्वाखातो भगवता धम्मो संदिठिको अकालिको एहिपस्सिको ओपनैको पच्चत्तं वेदितव्यो विनियोगीति आनन्दमयं धम्माभिगीतिं करोमसि स्वाखाततादिगुणयोगवसेन सेयो यो मग्गपाकपरियतिविमोक्षभेदो धम्मो कुलोकपतन तदधारी धारी वन्दामहं तमरं वरधम्ममेतं धम्मो यो सर्वपाणिनं शरणं खेममुत्तमं द्वितीयानुसतिष्ठानं वन्दामि तं शिरेणहं धम्मस्सास्मि दासीव धम्मो मे सामिकेसरो धम्मस्सहं नियादेमि शरीरं जीवितं चिदं वन्दन्तीहं चरिष्यामि धम्मस्यैव सुधम्मतं नत्थि मे शरणम् अन्यत् धम्मो मे शरणं वरम् एतेन सज्जवज्जेन वर्धेयं सत्तु शासने धम्मं मे वन्दमानाय यं पुण्यं प्रसुतं विद सभ्येऽपि अन्तरायामि माहेषुं तत्सतेजसा आनन्दमयं संघानुसतिनयं करोमसि सुपटिपन्नो भगवतो सावकसङ्गो उजुपटिपन्नो भगवतो सावकसङ्गो न्यायपटिपन्नो भगवतो सावकसङ्गो सामीचिपटिपन्नो भगवतो सावकसङ्गो यदिदं चत्वारि पुरुषयुगा अष्टपुरुषपुद्गला एष भगवतो सावकसङ्गो आहुनेयोपाहुनेयो दक्षिणेयो अञ्जलिकरणीयो अनुत्तरं पुण्यखेत लोकसाति आनन्दमयं संगाभिगीतिं करोमसि सधम्मजो सुपटिपतिगुणादियुतो यो अष्टविधो आर्यपुङ्गलसङ्गसेठो शीलादिधम्मपवरा सयकायचित्तो वन्दामहं तमर्यानगणं सुशुद्धं सङ्घो यो सर्वपाणिनं शरणं खेममुत्तमम् ततीयानुसतिष्ठान वन्दामि तं शिरेणहं सङ्गस्सास्मि दासीव सङ्घो मे सामिकेसरो सङ्गस्साहं नियादेमि शरीरं जीवितं चिदं वन्दन्तीहं चरिष्यामि सङ्घसोपटिपन्नतं नत्थि मे शरणम् अन्यत् सङ्घो मे शरणं वरम् एतेन सच्चवज्जेन वड्डेयं सतु शासने सङ्गं मे वन्दमानाय यं पुण्यं प्रसुतं विद सब्बेऽपि अन्तराया मे मायेषु तस्य तेजसा
अब हम प्रतिच्छ समुत्पाद की चैंटिंग करेंगे।
पेज 138
उसमें आगे करने बहुत तेज है।
नहीं बार कर थोड़ा सा लय से कुछ पटिच्च समुत्पाद अविद्या पच्चया संखारा संखार पच्चया विज्ञानम् विज्ञान पच्चया नाम रूपं नाम रूप पच्चया षडायतनं षडायतन पच्चया पस्सो भस्स पच्चया वेदना वेदना पच्चया तणहा तणहा पच्चया उपादानम् उपादान पच्चया भवो भव पच्चया जाति जाति पच्चया जरा मरणं शोक परिदेव दुःख दोमनस्य उपायासा सम्भवन्ति एवं एतस्य केवलस्य दुःखखण्डस्य समुदयो भूति अविद्याय त्वमेव अशेष विराग निरोधा संखार निरोधो संखार निरोधा विज्ञान निरोधो विज्ञान निरोधा नाम रूप निरोधो नाम रूप निरोधा षडायतन निरोधो षडायतन निरोधा फस्स निरोधो फस्स निरोधा वेदना निरोधो वेदना निरोधा तणहा निरोधो तणहा निरोधा उपादान निरोधो उपादान निरोधा भव निरोधो भव निरोधा जाति निरोधो जाति निरोधा जरा मरण शोक परिदेव दुःख दोमनस्य उपायासा निरुच्छन्ति एवं एतस्य केवलस्य दुःखखण्डस्य निरोधो भूति।
sit and listen to a Desana by Mr. Rodney Smith on the Vedananda Prashna. The title of the talk is Feelings Unleashing Thoughts.
So I want to thank everyone for coming out on this chilly evening. Supposed to get into the teens tonight. And this enormous avalanche of snow that has befallen us, some 2.5 inches, which shuts down the city for 2 days. But I really appreciate people turning out in spite of the difficulty. And next week will be a discussion on this particular topic. And this topic tonight is feelings unleashing thoughts. So we're building on feelings. We have looked upon the 3 feelings, tones, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And now we're seeing how they move the mind, how the feelings don't just settle as feelings, but they become something in themselves. And that becoming something in themselves creates the sense of self within their becoming. So we'll talk about that tonight. But I want to pull back just a little bit and just give a full embrace to what we're doing, a full embodiment of the practice. We started, of course, with the physicality of our body as a foundation of mindfulness. But a full embodiment of the body isn't just connecting with it. It's really knowing what's going on within it. It's, I think, in the most superficial understanding of the first foundation is just, having some mindful relationship with the body. But the exploration, the full investigation of what the body is, as well as what the mind does within the body. So that there's a complete understanding after these foundations are explored as to what this thing is and how it is in any particular moment and what it's holding in terms of its conscious and unconscious tendencies. And so there's no surprises in this thing anymore. And so what we're really doing is really embracing this mind and body with an intentional introspection, so that everything is known to us, everything is seen, everything is revealed to be what it is. And when we start looking at feelings, we need to understand what those are and how they line up and create and have some compelling force forward in our lives. And so all of this is beginning to make sense in terms of the foundations as to how this thing comes into being as a complete representation of myself with my history and my future and my present disposition. Now, so that's I think that's important to understand what we're doing here. We're not just trying to be present with the body as some physical sensation and then know when a feeling is occurring and then know when a state of mind is arising, etc. But really to see how they play upon each other to form the illusory sense of someone being in here and the world being outside of it. So as we build upon these block by block foundations, it's good to keep that in mind. But I want to take us back for a moment in terms of to tie this into the present talk this evening. There was a study that was highlighted in the New York Times, I think last week. And I'd just like to engage us in that study if we could. I think it was a Harvard study. And so I would like to ask you to just close your eyes. And I'd like you to deliberately daydream. Close your eyes and let your mind wander without trying to be mindfully present. To see where it goes. Okay, so you can open your eyes. Some of you probably couldn't get out of the present to allow yourself to escape, but that's to your credit. However, what this study did was it randomly selected cell phones, I guess in some 100, 200, 500 people, and it would call them at odd times during the day, and it would, when the phone rang, the person was to tell them where their mind was at the point when when the bell rang, when their phone rang, not when they answered the phone. And in that way, they did a sort of a study of where minds were when the phone rang. And so here was the result. Some 47% of the time when the phone rang, the minds had wandered to another location. They weren't present at the location where the phone rang. All right, so, and the person that was doing the study says, I find it kind of weird to look down a crowded street and realize that half the people aren't really there. But I would actually say that probably upwards to 99% of the people weren't really there, even though they may have been thinking about what they were doing at that moment in that location. That doesn't mean that they were present to that moment. That the thought was just not sending them to another location. But most of the time we spend kind of mulling over what's going on in our life here, trying to figure out logistically how to deal with the problems, but still our mind isn't really present because it's being interceded by a thought. A thought buffers ourselves from that present. And the person said, wherever your mind went, this study shows that daydreaming would not make you as happy as being present. Some scale of happiness. I guess the people who they called up and were actually present at that moment, their scale of happiness was higher than those whose minds were wandering to a different location. He said, even if you're doing something that's really enjoyable, that doesn't seem to protect against negative thoughts. The rate of mind wandering is lower for more enjoyable activities, but when people do wander, they are just as likely to wander towards negative thoughts. And whatever people are doing, whether it is having sex or reading or shopping, they tend to be happier if they focus on the activity they're doing instead of thinking about something else. So I always like these very tangential references and validations of Buddha Dharma. And this is one. Because let's just take apart just a little bit. No matter what, even if you're doing something that's really enjoyable, that doesn't seem to protect against negative thoughts. And the rate of mind wandering is lower for more enjoyable activities, but when people do wander, they are just as likely to wander towards negative thoughts. So, just because you're doing something enjoyable doesn't mean that you aren't miserable. Basically, that your thoughts, if you let them wander, won't take you to a miserable location or an attitude or a cantankerous disposition or whatever. And that there's also, that if you focus in on the activity you're doing, whether it be an enjoyable activity or not, but just focusing on the activity that you're doing, instead of thinking about something else, you're ultimately more likely to be happy and focusing on that. So when you limit it, the range of the wandering thoughts, in other words. So I think this is very interesting, and I think it has a lot to do with what I'm going to talk about tonight, which is feelings unleashing thoughts. But we get a sense that even science now is verifying sort of the groundwork of what we're going to be saying. And the groundwork starts out with a word in Pali that many of us know. It's a quite familiar word to some of us, and that's papancha. Papancha sounds like what it is. It's the elaboration of thinking. It's papanchan, right? Your mind just is proliferating outwards and obsessively, and you can't reel it in. The root of papancha means spreading out. It's the unbidden going of the mind. I like that. It's not that we are wanting it to go out that way. It's just going out that way. It's like the spreading of oil on water. It just moves, and it's boundaryless. It doesn't stop. It just keeps spreading. And one commentator spoke about it like this, and notice that as he's speaking about it, he's papanchizing. One commentator on papancha defines it this way: the propensity of the worldling's imagination to erupt in an effusive of mental commentary that obscures the bare data of cognition. I don't know where that guy was, but and I always look at when you areas of papancha that are quite revealing. Here's one. The New York Times comments that the Lord's Prayer contains 56 words. The Gettysburg Address contains 226 words. The Ten Commandments, 227 words. And the U.S. Agricultural Directive on pricing cabbage weighs in at 15,629 words. So papancha is well. So, but it's not just the U.S. government that has endless commentary about life. It's us. We do. And it's important to begin to realize the value and limitation of this endless spreading out of language from a base camp of feeling. And what's it doing? How does this work? How does it get going like that? What compels it and propels it onward? Why does it seem to be so difficult to have any objectivity to it? Right? Just thinking, and most of us, all of us have had the experience of just getting lost in this meaningless, trivial nonsense. But you can't seem to get any objective stance to it. It just seems to have its own life within. And one thing I can say is that as people begin to practice, I would say that that we spend less and less of our mental frame of reference in time. I would say that was true from almost the beginning. When you begin to sit down and just see what the mind does endlessly in its chatter, and that losing ourselves in some kind of daydream or imagination, which we often foster before we realize what we're doing to ourselves, we just bring it on because it's so much more pleasant than just sitting there idly waiting for a bus. Why not just lose ourselves in thinking rather than actually having to sit there and do nothing while you wait? And much of the reading that we do in terms of fantasy, in other words, kind of compels us into a state that drives its own imaginative response to that reading, and on it goes. And I think as we begin to meditate, that there does become a limitation of that endless proliferation. And I can remember that suddenly fantasies just weren't fun anymore. It just wasn't fun. And this doesn't take very long in practice to begin to realize that, just letting your mind wander endlessly just didn't have the same point and purpose that it did prior to my understanding what it was doing. And then very slowly, as practice develops, the ventures out into time become of shorter duration. Oh yes, we still worry about the future, and we still regret about the past, but we don't spend as much time doing that, and we don't necessarily lose ourselves in the fantasies and the histories of our early childhood and just trying to recollect everything. It just doesn't make any sense anymore to spend that kind of time doing that. I was walking with Joseph this summer, and I was just, I was telling him, I said, I just don't have the same memory that I used to. And he says, I don't either. I said, but I think that that's actually wisdom. I think that I just don't see the point in trying to remember things. And he said he agreed. He agreed. He says, what is the point? And I think so that as the practice develops, I think that you just start limiting the slavery to time. And I think that's an important demarcation to note in ourselves. That it just isn't as valuable to spend time just aloft and away. So let's look at how this works, this proliferation. We need to get in on the investigation of this. Now, remember that we're trying to embody this practice. And to embody this practice is not just to have an intellectual understanding of papancha, but to really experience papancha. It's the difference, I think, is the difference between engaging in a teaching rather than following a teaching. If you sit there passively and listen to a teaching, you'll follow it. You'll follow it intellectually. You may even reflect upon parts of it, and it will have a minor effect upon you. But a full engagement of the teaching requires some interest within the activity of where the teaching is pointing. And much of that, the Buddha said there are many ways to have insight. One of that is by listening. You can listen and have insights as you listen. It depends on how you listen. You listen introspectively so that you let the words take you to your experience of where the words are pointing. And you can actually have insights, not just an intellectual grasping, but an actual integration, an engaged activity with the teaching. And so this ultimately is where we are trying to go in our teaching here at Sims, is to have an engaged relationship to the teaching so that we're moving with it and seeing and flushing out the areas of our lives and where the teaching is pointing. So this teaching of papancha, or proliferation of thoughts being unleashed by feelings, starts, of course, on contact. Now, any sense door doesn't require a particular sense door for this proliferation to occur. In fact, I don't know if any of you have ever read The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, James Thurber short story. Some of you are probably much too young to even know about it, but James Thurber had this man, Walter Mitty, who in this short story would completely lose reference to where he was because of a certain sound he would hear that would take him into a fantasy world. And so one of them was something like, he had a tick, tick, tick of a motor, or something was ticking in his car, and that took him to the beating of an engine in an airplane, and the airplane was on fire, and he was going down, and everybody was saying, well, the captain will save us, and of course he was the captain, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this shout comes, "You're driving too slowly, dear. What's the matter with you?" Which is his wife next to him in the car, who wakes him up out of the fantasy. But that tendency for us just to skip with touching on contact. The contact. What's wrong with the contact? Contact, feeling. Feeling. The moment you're in the car, there's an expression or a feeling. It may not be pleasant. Having perhaps a disagreeable wife next to you, and so all of a sudden your mind just skips. It can't stay in the car. It's with that unpleasantness. So it finds its own route towards the pleasant, which for Walter Mitty, of course, was a complete disassociation from being in the car at all. And so contact, feeling, and then there's perception. Perception. Now, perception contains two different qualities. It contains recognition and it contains memory. And so when there's contact, then there's feeling on base of that contact, and then there can be a recognition, and that can create even more of a sense of feeling from the sense of recognition and the memory of what has been. You can have a feeling about something before you recognize what it is. And then when you recognize, like an example is, I don't know how many of you have been out to Magnuson Park, but they have these the sculptures of these whales, or I guess they're supposed to be orcas, right? Fins of whales. So I didn't know what they were. I had a feeling about them. I mean, I didn't, my own taste, I didn't particularly like them. I didn't know what they were. Turns out they're wings of an airplane that are stuck up in the soil. Anyway, so then somebody explained what that sculpture was, and so I had a recognition and perception, and then I had a different feeling. I said, oh, this guy's a pod of orcas. And so then I started thinking about, what it took to bring an airplane wing, dig it into the soil to make it look like a fin of an orcas. And so then my papancha started by thinking of all the people hours that took and the money to create something that really wasn't that special, in my opinion, at all. So, but anyway, the whole thing was much more, an analogy that comes to mind is like being on a diving board. You walk up the steps, you touch the board, contact. The contact sends, immediately upon contact is a feeling. A pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Now, it has to be one of those three. It's like yes, no, and maybe. There's no other, you can't answer anything but yes, no, and maybe, pleasant, unpleasant, or feeling. So it's got to be one of those feeling tones that you meet. And then perception and recognition, and then you're at the edge of the board, and you're sprung down on the board, and flight into the fantasy. Now you no longer have your feet on the surface any longer, and you're just lost in the air of thinking. But it's wonderful up there because it feels as if you're flying, that you can go anywhere. It's boundaryless. It doesn't have there are no areas in which you can't go, in which the thought can't travel. And in that sense, it gives an incredible sense of power if you can lose yourself in the thought and actually believe the thought is real, then it gives you more of a sense of power. The problem is, though, when you have some sense of meditation within you, some sense of groundedness, you know that you're doing it. And that, of course, disrupts the whole flight from being an imaginative, open experience to one that's very closed and limited. And so, again, it starts reeling us in a little bit. But there is that moment of time for many people who don't have any ground, where they are off. They're the Walter Mittys of the world. And they can float and fly freely, of course, until they land on Earth, which is where reality is in opposition to the way they're thinking. When the disagreeable wife, wakes you up out of your dive, suddenly you're in crash tone and you can no longer escape. And The delight you had in the escape is directly proportional to the distaste you have in coming back to the reality. And so you really face the fact of the disagreeable in that moment. Now, I just want to give a sense of how emotions play into this. Perceptions lead to emotions. Now, as we begin to perceive something, there is a history we've had with what we are perceiving. And sometimes it is an exact history, meaning we've met that person before. Sometimes the person is an inexact replica, meaning they remind us of somebody who we've met before. In any case, the same feeling comes forward. And we place it upon that person, place, or thing. Because our mind has a tremendous ability to generalize from its past to the specific of what it's looking at or perceiving or in contact with. But in a feeling, because it has to be no, yes, or maybe, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, will object to or disengage from the experience, quite likely based upon nothing else but a historical representation of that object. But we're lost. We don't care about them anymore. You remind me of my mother. Fine, but I'm not. Doesn't matter, you see, because the feeling has placed itself representatively right there. And then the emotion starts arising from that particular contact. Doesn't matter whether it's your mother or a representation. The emotional history, the feeling tone, and the recognition opens a gate, a floodgate, in which the emotions start coming forth. And because we're not clear in ourselves about, we misrepresent the person as being the mother or the father of the past, we just let that, it's uncensored emotion. It just comes out with all of the negation and all of the difficulty and reactivity that we had with the original person. And we then just steamroll, our emotion just gets steamed up. Now as our emotion comes into view, we have another feeling from that experience. And if it's an unpleasant experience, then the feeling, of course, is unpleasantness, which reignites a whole reactivity. So now the perception had a feeling, the recognition in history had the feeling, now the emotion arises, it has another feeling or a same intense feeling, and the whole thing now adds momentum. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It gains momentum on its own. And we get lost, then we can start having images or flashbacks of our mother or whoever it might be, and we have forced our story into a conclusion. Our story then gets compelled into that. That's where the thinking takes over into papancha. Gets brought, even though part of the story realizes that this person in front of you isn't your mother, still the emotion has such momentum, it can't stop the same conclusion from arising. Even though the person we realize is not our mother, emotionally we do not realize it. Emotionally we have such a lack of intelligence with our emotional life that it's the thing that we have invested in and continues to hold our consciousness within it. Now I just want to take a little sidestep here and talk about our emotional intelligence, because this is extremely important and often evaded. Many of us evade this point because we're uncomfortable with this level of psychic memory. But within each of our bodies, within each of our psyches, is an emotional history. And that emotional history arises given the proper context and situations. When they're arising externally, it releases some of our emotional history. We're very good in this spiritual culture in noticing judgment, noticing that we're upset, noticing that we're irritated, noticing that we're reactive. We're very poor at being able to investigate sufficiently the cause of that reactivity. That cause of that reactivity is embedded within the moment's expression of the reaction. You don't have to look somewhere else. You don't have to do a biological assessment of yourself to find out where this reactivity comes from. In the moment that that reaction occurs, if we listen carefully to ourselves, you'll hear the emotional residue, the emotional intelligence that holds that particular depiction of events. For instance, if we are with our mother, we might get a feeling inside of some sense of being controlled, or of maybe being not listened to, negated in some way, or just completely forgotten, abandoned or some way. I don't know. Depends on the history of the mother. And then and then we'll react, and we'll have a hard time being with our mother on Thanksgiving or wherever it is. But if we're quiet in that moment, if we're just willing to be quiet, you'll feel the emotional residue of what we are saying to ourselves through the emotion, through the feeling and the reaction to the feeling, creating more emotion and the truth of that. And we just because we let it just move on its own without any awareness of it, it holds a kind of circular truth that just keeps revolving back around. And now the emotional body, the emotional intelligence, sometimes is an emotion itself. Often there are subtle nuances of words or images that come in through that feeling tone. Oftentimes there's a way that the sense of self is being holds itself in relationship to that. Like negation, it's feeling incredible despondency or despair, or not being seen. And you can feel all of that, but it's that degree of subtlety that has to arise consciously with those emotional imprints in order for those imprints to be completely flushed out. Otherwise, the subtlety consists and maintains itself over time. Continuing to brood within a feeling, investing in an emotional response, conjuring up memories, and the whole thing. We can take the steam and the pressure off the pot, but unless we turn down the burner or turn off the burner, that's just a temporary, satisfactory expulsion of energy. I mean, as soon as you put the top back on, it starts boiling again. And I think that's why we are often incomplete in our complete resolution of emotional traumas. And I don't mean traumas in terms of abuse. I mean traumas just in terms of the psychological disarray that many of us were in as we grew up. And it needs that kind of subtlety from us. It needs that willingness and intentionality to know this about ourselves. But few people want to go there because it's too unpleasant. It reminds us too much of what our past was. It brings up too many issues for us. We get lost in the issues. We just lose our bearing within those issues. And then when we're lost within that, then we're just completely helpless. And we have no way to find our way back. But if we realize that the feeling tone, if we can feel the feeling tone of what is arising in that moment, it gives us a very nice base to be able to see what's arising on top of that feeling tone, the unpleasantness. If we're willing to hold the unpleasantness as the unpleasant, or the pleasant as the pleasant, either one, both are insidious. and just okay, I get just the willingness and the intentionality to expand so that you aren't contracting to this feeling, but expanding and being able to hold it. I can do this. So what? This is okay. And on it'll go. Now, just to give you a personal story of when I was a monk, there's not a lot you do when you're a monk. There's a lot of neutral time. So my mind just starts engaging, if I allowed it to just engage upon anything that happened to make it exciting. Put some spice in this life. So I remember one time I was given some kind of root, Thai root. I didn't know what I was eating. I just ate it. Anyway, and then I urinated and it came out red. Now, if I had eaten a beet, I would know that, but it wasn't a beet, it was something else. So I didn't put the two one and one together, and I thought, oh my God, what? Bladder cancer. When you have a lot of time on your hands, you go right to the result, right to the prognosis even. You don't have to go see a doctor. You already know you're going to die in 6 months. And even then, I would go and tell another monk. He'd say, "You're crazy," and then I'd say, "Yeah, you're right." And I'd go back, and a week or two later, I'd have another problem. And then he'd come to me, and he'd have some problem like that, and I'd say, "You're crazy," and he'd say, "Yeah, you're right," and we kept. But with time on your hands, the mind will just. You see, it's trying to find something besides the neutral, something to stir it up, something to keep it alive. And this is the advantage. This is a very strong advantage of reactivity, of proliferation, is that it stirs things up. It keeps life interesting. It keeps a story being told. It keeps a narrative going. It keeps something that you can fight against. It keeps you... God, this is awful, this is awful, believe me, is better than this is uninteresting. And so I want us to each look at our lives and see where we keep it awful so that we won't be uninterested. Because it's in there. And as we begin to go from contact to feeling to perception to thinking to papancha, we are sculpturing ourselves out of clay. I can't think of any other way to frame this thing. But we arise from an unobserved feeling. Now, a feeling isn't complete, is it? It's not a resolution. It's a feeling. Pleasantness isn't a resolution. It's not complete, is it? It's just a feeling. And so now you begin to see why the sense of self, as it arises within these feeling tones, never feels complete, because it's a feeling. There's no end to a feeling. It just kind of wavers, it goes up and down, waxes and wanes, and then changes to another feeling. And there's no sense of ownership to a feeling, because it's just kind of, in fact, it's quite the opposite. We project out our feelings. We don't own them at all. We don't even give them any credence that they're happening to us. We think they're happening within the object or person that happens to hold our feeling. And then we react to the object or person as if they were unpleasant in their intrinsic nature, rather than we gave it to them as a gift through our feeling. And so the sense of self never gets resolved. Feelings are not final or absolute. And so the story is continually modified as the feelings are modified, as we try to find some conclusion. But feelings, as I was saying, they have no boundaries, you see. There's no finality to them. And so they just keep us seeking fulfillment within that foreverness of them. Now, this is crazy, Megan. This is crazy making. Also, it's crazy making when you realize that each of us have psychic weak spots within ourselves. Areas where, when we're pressed, when conditions are similar, we will go to them. Perhaps, for instance, you may feel like you've never been properly appreciated in your life, and then you'll have a job, volunteer or otherwise, in which you don't feel like you're being appreciated enough. That feeling will come out. I'm not being appreciated. Someone else who will be doing that same job may feel not that at all. But then the whole sense of being unappreciated starts percolating and being processed, and we start spreading it out in terms of conclusion. He or she is an inappropriate boss. They don't thank me enough. They don't give me enough backslapping goodwill wishes. I'm not being appreciated. I'm out of here. And look at the patterns over time. These things don't resolve themselves. We find ourselves in the same conditioned feeling, tone, pattern, thought, apancha, time and time again. Relationship after relationship, job after job after job. Never taking ownership of the reactivity in itself. Never. The psychic weak spots. It doesn't take long for conditions to bring up our psychic weak spots. And then that feeling will immediately emerge, and because has such momentum from the past, along will come a whole story and narrative associated with it, complete with an attitude and a psychic posture to life, convinced once more we are being unappreciated in life. Personal conclusion, right? From what? Looking at the breath. We started looking at the breath. And it turned out I can't do this. I hate breathing. Everybody's doing it better than I am. I'm terrible at this. Where did that come from? It came from a psychic weak spot. And those psychic weak spots are just waiting, because those contain the self-assumption. So when the self is blown and the conditions are right, the self is going to speak from those weak spots, because that's where he or she believes about him or herself. The mind spreading out. The mind proliferating out. My teacher, Ajahn Buddhadasa, someone asked him once, what was the disposition of the world? How did he see the world? He said, the world is lost in thought. The world is lost in thought. And then, of course, the next step are actions. Actions from the rationale of the feelings, acquiring the desire or eliminating the threat, or continuing the theme of our life. All from pretending. All from pretending. It's like this old story about the young boy who says, Mom, pretend you are walking in the jungle and you're surrounded by 100 tigers. What would you do? And the mother thinks about it and says, I don't know what I would do. And the young child says, I would stop pretending. Suddenly the problem is gone, isn't it? Suddenly the problem has disappeared. May I say that problems will disappear. They will disappear. Your life will become spacious, open, non-formed in that sense of antagonist and protagonist. But what will come in there is the disposition of uninteresting, because we have learned to keep our life so jacked up on intense feeling tones created by my subversive thinking and projection that we are reluctant to give up the intensity of that entertaining experience, even though it comes back to bite us again and again and again, and just fall to a simplicity, to ordinariness. And there's some time that's required to live within the neutral feelings before the neutral feelings are seen to take us to a new dimension. They seem to indicate a drab life. And so we'll keep it stirred up. We'll keep ourselves surrounded by tigers. Now, look, have we looked at thought in your practice? Have you spent some time with thought? Have you seen what it is? Are you engaged in this practice? Or just following it? And as we understand what thought is, we realize we don't have any control over it. It just comes. And the less we infuse credibility into it, the less it comes. The more it comes when we invest energy into it to sustain our interest in the feeling tone that it's creating, or the opposite is also true. And notice the hypnotic trance, the Walter Mitty hypnotic trance that we induce ourselves into again and again and again. And the circular thinking that we go through, trying to think ourselves out of an emotional response that we're having. If your thoughts are going around and around, which was one form of papancha, just going around and around and around, what the thoughts are trying to do is solve the emotion at its base, at the hub. But instead of acknowledging the emotion at the hub, we just let the thoughts try to solve the emotion. How can a thought, just dharmically consider this, how can a thought solve an emotion? Of course it can't. Those are two different experiences. One festering and feeding the other, like a cat chasing its own tail, often intertwined and dependent upon one another. But you can't solve one with the other. You can't think your way out of an emotion. So to go to the emotion and just be present to the emotion rather than letting it drive itself into some analytical interpretation seems to me dharmically to make far greater sense. And we want to ignore the emotional pain and get to the conceptual understanding and resolution of that pain. So we don't even honor the emotion in the same way that we infuse our interest in the thinking. We think we can think our way out of our emotional problems. That's not engaged dharma. Thoughts do not bring clarity. We have to stay here for clarity to come. And even that very simple study in the New York Times indicated something. It indicated where happiness lies. It indicated the direction of happiness. It indicated the direction of joy. It indicated the direction of fulfillment. Are you spending your time wandering? Well, you're going to wander into unpleasant thoughts as quickly as pleasant ones. But if you stay present within the activity, if you get interested in what is going on here, you won't be bored, it will not be neutral, and you will find the resolution of joy, the fulfillment and completion of life here. This then is what Buddhism is all about. The me falls apart. The me falls apart. Because it's no longer being built up by story, by reaction to feeling, by infusion of thought with emotions, and emotions reacting to thought, and then feelings playing in and on, and the trying to escape our own internal processes. Is there aliveness, and this is a question for each of you, is there aliveness without story? Is there aliveness with story, or is aliveness to be found without story? Let us decide and determine which life is best lived. Thank you. So if we can just sit for a minute or two.
संक्षेप में प्रवचन का सारांश बता देते हैं। आज प्रवचन का मुख्य बिंदु था कि किस तरह से वेदना से हमारे विचारों की उत्पत्ति होती है, प्रपंच चलता है और फिर हम उसी में उलझ जाते हैं। उन्होंने शुरुआत की एक हार्वर्ड की स्टडी से, जिसमें उन्होंने ये पाया कि आधे लोग, कम से कम आधे लोग जो हैं वो हर समय उनका मन भटकता ही रहता है, जहाँ पे वो हैं वहाँ पे नहीं होता, कहीं और ही घूमता रहता है। और इस कारण से वो जो थॉट्स आते हैं वो मोस्टली नेगेटिव थॉट आते हैं, चाहे वो बहुत उपयुक्त काम जो उनको अच्छा लगता है वो भी कर रहे हो, उसमें जब मन भटकता है तो हमेशा नेगेटिव थॉट्स ही आते हैं। तो इस कारण से परेशान रहते हैं लोग। और उन्होंने कहा कि जो अपने काम में इसमें जो कर रहे हैं और उसमें उनको अच्छा लगता है, उसमें इंटरेस्ट लेके फोकस लेके करते हैं, तो हमेशा अधिक खुश होते हैं दूसरों के उत्पाद में। तो उन्होंने कहा कि जो हमारी भगवान बुद्ध की टीचिंग है वो बिल्कुल यही हमें सिखाती है। शायद ये साइंटिफिक एक्सपेरिमेंट से ये बात सिद्ध होती है। तो हम सब पहचानते हैं किस तरह से प्रपंच में हम चलते जा रहे हैं और कुछ मन इधर उधर भटक रहा है। तो उन्होंने बताया कि वो ऐसा है कि वो फैलता ही रहता है। बड़ा अच्छा उदाहरण दिया कि पानी पे अगर तेल डाल दें तो अपने आप फैलता है, उसको कुछ करने की ज़रूरत नहीं पड़ती। ठीक उसी तरह से हमारा मन जो है प्रपंच बनाता है और बनाता ही चला जाता है, जब तक कि हम उसको देखें ना और रोकें, दुख ठीक से देखें। एक बात और उन्होंने कही उन सभी जो ऑडियंस थी उनकी, कि जब प्रवचन देते हैं तो आप उसके बारे में इंट्रोस्पेक्टिवली रिफ्लेक्ट भी करते रहना चाहिए, ताकि टीचिंग के साथ एंगेज करें, सिर्फ सुन के ना चले जाएं। तो उन्होंने वही बात बताई पतिच्छ समुत्पाद की, कि जब इंद्रियां किसी कांटेक्ट होता है उसके विषय से फस पचे वेदना, फिर वेदना उत्पन्न होती है। और जो वेदना होती है, फीलिंग जो आती है हमारी, उसके आधार पे हमारा परसेप्शन संज्ञा जागती है, और संज्ञा जो है मेमोरीज होती हैं उसके साथ। तो एसोसिएटिव थिंकिंग, उसके साथ जो चीज़ें जुड़ी हुई हैं वो याद आने लगती हैं, फिर उन्हीं के ऊपर हम भागने लगते हैं और एक के बाद एक कहीं से कहीं पहुंच जाते हैं। और वो सब इसीलिए हो रहा है कि हमने फीलिंग को देखा नहीं ठीक से उस समय, और उसके जो प्रतिक्रिया है वो चलती चली गई। तो उसके कुछ उदाहरण भी उन्होंने दिए। तो उन्होंने बताया कि हमारे शरीर के अंदर और हमारे मन के अंदर जो अनुशय क्लेश हैं शरीर में भी छुपे रहते हैं, और वो जो इमोशनल रेजिड्यू हमारे मन, शरीर और मन में छुपा हुआ है, वो हमारे को काफ़ी प्रपंच बढ़ाने में मदद करता है। तो हमें उसको भी देखना होगा और साधना के माध्यम से उससे निजात पानी होगी। और वो तभी पाएंगे जब वेदना को हम ठीक से देख पाएँ। उन्होंने उदाहरण दिया अपना कि जब वो भिक्षु थे, कहीं गए हुए थे, यूरिनेशन के लिए गए बाहर, तो देखा लाल रंग आ रहा था, उनको लगा रहे पता नहीं क्या होगा, पता नहीं, विचार जाके यहाँ रुका कि अब तो ब्लडर कैंसर हो ही गया है। फिर वो किसी भिक्षु के पास गए तो उन्होंने कहा क्या आप फालतू बात कर रहे हो। तो उनको सोचा और उन्होंने कहा हाँ छोड़ो, नहीं है। तो बताया कि इस तरह से प्रपंच किस तरह से कहाँ तक पहुँच जाता है। और वो बेसिक कारण क्या है कि आपने वो जो महसूस किया उसको हमने जाना नहीं, फीलिंग जो थी, वेदना जो थी, उसको आपने जाना नहीं, और उस वेदना को न जानने के कारण ये दिक्कत हुई। तो उन्होंने कहा कि वेदना के उसी कारण से आत्म भाव भी पैदा होता है कि मुझे परेशानी हो रही है, मुझे वेदना ऐसी नहीं हो रही, लेकिन क्योंकि वेदना बदलती रहती है तो उससे उतना रुकता नहीं है। लेकिन प्रपंच जब हो जाता है तो फिर वो और कंक्रीट हो जाती है। मैं का भाव कि प्रपंच जो है मेरे विचार हैं, मैं ही उसमें उलझ रहा हूँ, तो उससे वो मैं का भाव और पुष्ट हो जाता है। जैसे उदाहरण दिया कि किसी का मन में ये भाव है कि हाँ मेरे को लोग अप्रिसिएट नहीं करते, तो ये अगर उसके मन में अनुशय क्लेश है तो उसको हर जगह हर परिस्थिति पे ऐसा ही लगेगा। वो कहीं जाए, जॉब में जाएगी, कि फैमिली में होगा, कोई रिलेशनशिप में होगा, हर जगह उसको लगेगा, कोई भी कुछ कहेगा कि मुझे इसलिए कर रहे हैं कि वो मुझे अप्रिशिएट नहीं करता, कोई ये इसलिए ये भी मुझे अप्रिशिएट नहीं कर रहे। बेसिकली उसके अपने मन की जो अनुशय क्लेश है वो रिफ्लेक्ट हो रहा है, वो फीलिंग को देख नहीं पा रहा। उस तरह की, जैसे ही उस तरह की फीलिंग होगी अप्रिय, वो मन उस तरफ चला जाता है। तो इस तरह से हमारे जो उन्होंने कहा साइकिक वीक स्पॉट्स हैं, जो हमारी कमज़ोरियाँ हैं, जो बार बार उभर के आती हैं, उनको हमको जानना चाहिए ताकि उस समय फीलिंग के प्रति सजग होकर उससे निजात पा सकें। तो मैंने एक छोटा उदाहरण भी दिया कि किस तरह से आप प्रिटेंशंस में घबरा जाते हैं। कि एक बच्चा अपनी माँ से कहता है, माँ मान लो माँ आप जंगल में जा रही हैं और चारों तरफ से 100 टाइगर आ गए, तो आप क्या करोगी? तो माँ कहती है, बेटा पता नहीं क्या करूँगी। तो कहते हो आप मानना छोड़ दो। तो बच्चा कहता है मानना छोड़ दो, मैंने तो कहा था ना मान लो, तो आप मानना छोड़ दो, उसमें करना ही क्या है। तो ये एक उदाहरण दिया उन्होंने कि अधिकतर चीज़ें जो हम सोचते हैं वो अपने हमारी अजम्पशन ही होती है, हमारा प्रिटेंशन ही होता है, सत्य नहीं होता, लेकिन हम उसको सच मानते हैं और उसमें भटकते रहते हैं। और उसका एक मुख्य कारण उन्होंने बताया कि हमें जो न्यूट्रल फीलिंग्स होती हैं, अधिकतर जब वेदना असुखद दुखद होती है, वो हमको इंटरेस्टिंग नहीं लगती, और इंटरेस्टिंग नहीं लगती और प्रपंच इंटरेस्टिंग लगता है, तो इसलिए हम उस डायरेक्शन में चलते जाते हैं। और इसलिए न्यूट्रल फीलिंग को देखना ठीक से वो भी बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है। उसको देखेंगे तो हमें हमेशा अजीब सा ऐसा लगता है, कुछ नहीं हो रहा, कुछ इंटरेस्ट नहीं आ रहा, मज़ा नहीं आ रहा, पेन हो या प्लेजर हो तो ठीक लगता है। और इसलिए न्यूट्रल फीलिंग भी हमारे को प्रपंच की ओर काफ़ी ले जाने के लिए मोटिवेट करती हैं, और बस फिर उसी में भटकते रहते हैं क्योंकि उसमें इंटरेस्ट आता है। चाहे वो इंटरेस्ट इस तरह का हो कि हमारा दुख ही हो रहा है, लेकिन फिर भी इंटरेस्ट तो है। एक और बात उन्होंने बताई कि हम जब इस तरह से प्रपंच चलता है, इमोशंस आते हैं, तो हम सोचते हैं कि ठीक सोच के ही हम उससे बाहर निकल आएंगे। ये बड़ी मूर्खता की बात है। ऐसा संभव ही नहीं है कि कोई प्रपंच से सोचने से निकल आए, उसको देखना होगा। इसी तरह से इमोशंस जागते हैं हमारे, तो इमोशंस जब जागते हैं उसको भी कई बार हम सोचते हैं कि मैं इसको और एनालाइज कर लूँ और देख लूँ तो उसको मैं निकाल दूँगा। ऐसा संभव नहीं है। हमको उसके रूट पे, फीलिंग पे रोकना पड़ेगा। जैसे ही मालूम पड़े इमोशन है, उसको जांच लेंगे, क्योंकि जो भी विचार हमारे आते हैं, जो ऑटोमेटिक थॉट्स होते हैं, उनका कोई महत्व ही नहीं है, वो सब यूजलेस हैं, और उसको हमको कोई महत्व देना ही नहीं चाहिए। और जितना जितना हम वर्तमान में रहेंगे, उतना उतना हमारे प्रपंच कम बनेंगे, और उतनी उतनी दिक्कत कम होगी, और उतना उतना मैं का भाव कम होता चला जाएगा, क्योंकि मैं का भाव प्रपंच से बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ता रहता है। आज हम करुणा ब्रह्म विहार का ही अभ्यास करेंगे सिर्फ, ताकि थोड़ा समय ज़्यादा मिल जाए। तो करुणा ब्रह्म विहार का उद्देश्य, तात्पर्य, ये दुखी देख करुणा जगे। और इस समय तो दुख की बहुत आयत है, कोई कमी नहीं। कहीं भी आप नज़र फेरो तो परेशानी परेशानी। लाखों लोग इस महामारी से मृत्यु को प्राप्त हो चुके हैं, उनके परिवारों का दुख असीम, और 40-50 लाख लोग अभी भी विश्व भर में बीमार, और नज़दीक आए अपने देश में भी 80-90 हज़ार बीमार, अपने शहर में आए तो दिल्ली में भी 9-10 हज़ार लोग बीमार, इसी तरह मुंबई में, बड़े बड़े शहरों में 10,000 भी के करीब संख्या पहुंच रही है जल्दी से, तो बढ़ता ही जा रहा है। इसका अगर ज़रा भी हम थोड़ा सा भी ध्यान उस ओर दें विचार करें क्या हालत हो रही होगी अस्पतालों में, किस तरह से लोग परेशान हैं, इतनी संख्या में मरीज आ रहे हैं, डॉक्टरों का क्या हाल हो रहा होगा, कैसे वो उसका ख्याल रख पा रहे होंगे, और कितना कष्ट होता है इस बीमारी में जब ये आगे बढ़ जाए कुछ हद एक स्तर से आगे। तो वो याद करके, लोगों का दुख देख के, और इसके सिवा करोड़ों लोग जो घरों में बंद हैं उनका दुख आप सुनते रहते हैं कि किस तरह से मज़दूर एक जगह से दूसरी जगह जा रहे हैं, पैदल जा रहे हैं, परेशानी में हैं क्योंकि रोज़ी छूट गई, सब कुछ बंद पड़ा है। तो ये सब चीज़ें मन में हम लाएंगे तो बहुत पीड़ा होने की संभावना है, लेकिन उसको करुणा में बदलेंगे कि शुभेच्छा करेंगे कि हाँ इन सब के दुख दूर हो, हम जितना कुछ कर सकते हैं हम करें। दुर्भाग्य से हम लोग भी खुद दुख में, बंधनों में फंसे हुए हैं, तो एटलीस्ट हम शुभकामना कर सकते हैं, आर्थिक सहायता कर सकते हैं। तो साधना के तौर पे अच्छी शुभकामना, अच्छी तरंगे फैला सकते हैं ताकि लोगों को चित्त शांत हो, दुख मुक्ति में सहायक हो सके। तो इसलिए करुणा ब्रह्म विहार का मुख्य उद्देश्य यही कि दुखी देख करुणा जगे। तो दुखी को ध्यान करके थोड़ी देर 1-2 मिनट आंखों बंद करके ध्यान करके विजुअलाइज करके अपने मन में, अपने शरीर में वो भाव लाते हैं करुणा का। जिसका भी ख्याल आए उसका मन में बयान करते हैं। दुखा मुझंतु, दुख से मुक्ति हो, दुख से मुक्ति हो। क्योंकि दुख का मैग्नीट्यूड इतना ज़्यादा है तो हमें अपनी श्रद्धा के बल के आधार पे, भगवान के प्रति हमारी श्रद्धा के आधार पे, बुद्धों के प्रति हमारी श्रद्धा के आधार पे हम उन बुद्धों के गुणों को याद करते हैं, उनकी सिद्धियों को याद करते हैं, उनके करुणा सागर होने को याद करते हैं। ऐसी शुभेच्छा करते हैं इस सत्य वचन के आधार पे कि इस समय भी जो दुखी हैं प्राणी, उन सब के दुख दूर हों। तो इस आशय से मैंने ये आटानाटी सूत्र के कुछ वर्सेस हम चांट कर रहे हैं। हालांकि ये ट्रेडिशनल ऑर्थोडॉक्स तरीका नहीं है, लेकिन परिस्थिति इतनी अनप्रेसिडेंटेड है कि लगता है कि हमें और अपनी करुणा का बल बहुत कम पड़ेगा। सभी बुद्धों के, अरहंतों के करुणा का बल का आवाहन करना चाहिए। तो आए हम मिलके बहुत धीरे धीरे चैंटिंग करें, और चैंटिंग करते करते मन के अंदर वो भाव बढ़ते जाएं, शरीर में वो भाव बढ़ते जाएं, हमारा मन करुणा से द्रवित हो और शरीर में उसका असर दिखने लगे। तो फिर शरीर पे भी, वेदना के ऊपर भी ध्यान देंगे। वचसा मनसा चैव वन्दामि ते तथागते, शयने आसने ठाने गमने चापि सर्वदा, सदा सुखेन रक्षन्तु बुद्धा सन्ति करातुवं, ते हि त्वं रक्षितो सन्तो मुक्तो सर्वभयेन च। सर्वरोगविनिमुक्तो संतापवर्जितो सर्वैरमतिकन्तो निम्बुतो च तुअं भवन्। हम बुद्धों की पारमियों को याद करके ते संसच्चेन शीलेन खन्ति मेत्ताबलेन च तेऽपि तुम्हें अनुरक्षन्तु आरोग्येन सुखेन च। चारों दिशाओं में जो महान यद्धि वाले देवलोक के प्राणी हैं, उनकी यद्धियों को याद करते हुए ये शुभेच्छा करते हैं कि वे सबके रोग दुख मुक्त हों, सुख दोबारा से लौटे। पुरथिमस्मिन् दिशा भागे सन्ति भूता महिन्दिका तेऽपि तुम्हें अनुरक्षन्तु आरोग्येन सुखेन च। पश्चिमस्मिन् दिशा भागे सन्ति नागा महिन्दिका तेऽपि तुम्हें अनुरक्षन्तु आरोग्येन सुखेन च। उत्तरस्मिन् दिशा भागे
दक्षिणस्मिन् में दीवानी बोला, पश्चिम दक्षिणस्मिन् बोल के नागा बोल दिया।
दक्षिणस्मिन् दिशा भागे सन्ति देवा महिन्दिका तेऽपि तुम्हें अनुरक्षन्तु आरोग्येन सुखेन। पश्चिमस्मिन् दिशा भागे सन्ति नागा महिन्दिका तेऽपि तुम्हें अनुरक्षन्तु आरोग्येन सुखेन च। उत्तरस्मिन् दिशा भागे सन्ति यक्षा महिन्दिका तेऽपि तुम्हें अनुरक्षन्तु आरोग्येन सुखेन च। जो चारों दिशाओं के जो चतुर महाराज का लोकपाल लोग हैं, उनका याद करके, उनकी दिबल को, यश को याद करके ये शुभेच्छा करते हैं कि वो रक्षा करें सब दुखियों की और उनके रोग से मुक्ति दिलाएं। चत्तारो नहीं पुरीं दिशं धतरट्ठो दक्षिणेन विरुल्लको पश्चिमेन विरूपक्षो कुबेरोत्तरं दिशं। चत्तारो ते महाराजा लोकपाला यशस्विनो तेऽपि तुम्हें अनुरक्षन्तु आरोग्येन सुखेन च। आकाशट्ठा च भूमट्ठा देवानागा महिन्दिका तेऽपि तुम्हें अनुरक्षन्तु आरोग्येन सुखेन च। संवीति सुखो रोगो विनश्यतु माते भवतु अंतरायो सुखी दीर्घायुको भव सुखी दीर्घायुको भव सुखी दीर्घायुको भव। अब अपने शरीर को हम इन करुणा की तरंगों से भरने का अभ्यास करते हैं। हृदय वस्तु पे पहले ध्यान करके फिर फैला सकते हैं, या कहीं भी जहाँ स्वतः ही नेचुरली ऐसी संवेदनाएं महसूस हो रही हैं, फीलिंग्स हो रही हैं, उसकी ओर ध्यान करके फिर उसको सारे शरीर में व्याप्त करने का प्रयास करते हैं। बहुत सहज रूप से, कोई ज़ोर ज़बरदस्ती नहीं करेंगे। कुछ भी महसूस ना हो रहा हो तो सिर से शुरू करके सारा बॉडी स्कैन कर सकते हैं, उससे भी करुणा का भाव बना रहेगा, तो उससे भी वो सारे शरीर में हल्की हल्की तरंगे आ जाएंगी। ऐसा करने में मन भटक भी सकता है, उसको कोई बुरा नहीं मानेंगे। स्माइलिंगली उसको वापस ले आएंगे मन को, फिर शरीर पे तरंगों को देखते रहेंगे। और अब उनको फहराने का प्रयास करते हैं अपने सामने वाली दिशा में। इस भाव के साथ कि इन तरंगों के प्रभाव से सबके दुख दूर हो, दुख का शमन हो। दाहिनी डायरेक्शन में, राइट साइड में पीछे के साइड में, पीठ के पीछे वाली डायरेक्शन, बाईं तरफ। जैसे हम बार बार अभ्यास करेंगे तो स्वतः ही तरंगे अपने आप बाहर निकलने लगती हैं। फिर इन बीच की दिशाओं, चारों बीच की दिशाओं में आड़े तिरछे और फिर नीचे की दिशा, ऊपर की दिशा, हर दिशा में रहने वाले जो भी प्राणी दुख में अनुभव कर रहे हैं इस समय, उन सब के दुख दूर हो, ऐसी शुभकामना मन में करते हैं। जितनी गहराई से अंतर मन से करेंगे उतनी तरंगे भी प्रबल होंगी। सहगतेन चेतसा विपुलेन महगतेन अपमानेन अवैरेण अव्यापज्येन फलित्वा विहरति। तो हम इस भगवान के निर्देश के अनुसार साधना कर रहे हैं। दो बातें का ख्याल खास कर रखेंगे। अवैरेण अव्यापज्येन, कोई भी किसी के प्रति भी वैर नहीं। जो दुखी है खास तौर पर उसके प्रति तो कोई वैर रखने का औचित्य नहीं रहता और कोई दुर्भावना नहीं। कई बार जिनके प्रति वैर हो उनके दुख देखने में प्रसन्नता महसूस होने लगती है। इसलिए भगवान ने इस खास तौर पर शब्द उसमें याद दिलाने के लिए हमको डाले हैं। करुणा सहगतेन चेतसा विपुलेन महगतेन अपमानेन अवैरेण अव्यापज्येन फलित्वा विहरति। असीम विपुल करुणा की तरंगे चारों ओर फैले, हमारे शरीर में व्याप्त हो जाए। थोड़ी देर हम उनको शरीर में महसूस कर सकते हैं। समापन के तौर पे भवतु सब मंगलम करते हैं। भवतु सब मंगलम रक्षन्तु सब देवता सब बुद्धानुभावेन सदा सुखी भवन्तु मे। भवतु सब मंगलम रक्षन्तु सब देवता सब धम्मानुभावेन सदा सुखी भवन्तु ते। भवतु सब मंगलं रक्षन्तु सब देवता सब संघानुभावेन सदा सुखी भवन्तु ते। सम्बुद्धो भगवा बुद्धं भगवन्तं अभिवादेमि। स्वागतो भगवता धम्मो धम्मनमस्सामि। सुपटिपन्नो भगवतो सावक संघो संघं